new Miura product. What more does a golf geek like me want than new Miuras? So they don't launch very often, particularly with wedges. It's been a while since they've had a new product launch. We've got the previous model mill tour wedge here. We now have a return of the C and the Y grinds. Now these are grinds that Miura have done or variants of in the past. You know, the Y stands for Yoshitaka. Yoshitaka Miura is one of Mr. Miura's sons, and there are two different profiles with a C grind and this Y grind that now Miura's lacked for a number of years, in my opinion, a grind that caters to someone who's a little bit steeper and tends to play on a little bit of a softer turf that requires a higher bounce profile, but they have delivered with these. So we're going to dig a little bit into what's different. The actual materials of the head are the same as that they've always been, but what they've done is created some really quite different sole shapes that account for someone who's a little bit steeper or plays on a slightly softer turf. I'm particularly excited about this because I'm steep. So I haven't played a Miura wedge for a number of years, but these have really piqued my interest. So what are the differences? So I'm going to start with the Y grind. So I'm going to compare it against the tour wedge that's been out for a few years now. So the tour wedge is a relatively shallow sole shape. So you know it's not a sharp leading edge. There's a little bit of rounding on the leading edge, but a moderate bounce with a bit of trail on that back half. So it's something that, whilst there is a reasonable amount, it's not a high bounce profile. So how does the Y grind differ? Now, two of the biggest aspects of this are to do with back edge, or both back edge and front edge. So the biggest change in the front edge, there's really quite a rounded, what we call killed leading edge. So what that does is it creates bounce early on in the wedge head. So if you get a little bit steeper, then that leading edge, if it's sharp, can catch the turf. Because this has been kind of beveled off, ground off quite strongly, straight away on that leading edge, you're getting a leading edge that squirts through the turf. So it's not digging in and catching. It helps to rebuff that a little bit and kick it away from the turf, allowing it then to glide forward. So particularly if you get a little bit of handle lead like I do, that on softer turf in particular, that makes a massive difference. What we also have is more of a full grind, so that back edge sits noticeably higher. So we'll do a zoom in on these, but if you compare them side to side, what you get with the tour wedge is more of a graduation off. So shallow sole, graduation off, and on the Y, a blunter leading edge, a higher back edge, and then a straighter back edge, so it's a higher peak on the back. So there's lots more bounce to use for somebody who gets a little bit steeper and it's down into the turf or plays in softer turf, softer sand. So that's a really big addition. The C grind similarly has that little bit more rounding on the leading edge. So that's something that they've incorporated into both heads, is a more graduated front edge. It's not as aggressive as the Y grind, but still got a bit of rounding off that again helps that turf interaction. But what we have on the C grind is kind of a bit of graduation on the back edge and the toe and the heel. So this is to make it as versatile as possible. So with a very few call it an M grind. A lot of the brands call this a C grind because of the shaping of that sole. It's a C shape on that back edge, but really it's to provide a bit of bounce in the middle section and a kind of a softer, for want of a better phrase, softer front edge, which stops it catching. A moderate bounce, but then a sole shape that allows you to work the head underneath, shallow it through and play softer, higher shots for somebody who's not necessarily quite as steep. But the key addition on both of these is that beveled front edge. What Miura have also done on both of these, as you'll see on the back here, the little groove running across, channel running across horizontally across the back of the head. That is a bit of a narrowing. Now that allows them to take weight away from this section here and they're replacing it higher up the face. And this is all about getting center of mass up the head to get that lower launch and to keep spin up. So contrary to what you might think, if you get weight down the bottom of the head, then you catch the strike point above the center of mass line and actually gear spin off. The reason why a thin shot or a slightly thin shot comes out low, skids and then grabs hard is because low on the face, that strike point actually increases spin. So by getting the center of mass up, you keep the launch down and the spin up, which is what we're all looking for on wedge shots. And they do this across the board on both options. So they're really focusing on a little bit of a change in overall head shape. They're slightly neater according to the crutch of the head into that section here. It's a slightly shallower head here, and so a slightly neater transition into the hosel. They've kept that very, very kind of square, kind of, I don't know, say square, level, front edge of hosel into front edge of the wedge face. I personally like that. I don't like seeing a lot of offset on wedges. That's a completely personal thing, but that's something that tracks again across a lot of the Miura irons. There's very little offset, but yeah, slightly higher center of mass, but much more versatile sole shapes. So I'm going to do a little bit of a demo on what kind of deliveries suit these and where the strike points occur on the head as to why you might use one grind versus the next, and then talk a little bit about how they feel. So we're going to start with the original milled grind. So this is the one that's been around a few years, the slightly shallower sole shape. So we're going to start with a little bit of a shallower delivery rather than getting too steep, which is what suits this. And we'll give you a bit of explainer about the strike points and why they're better. So if I go in with a little bit of a less steep delivery here. So a little bit, say, shallower through, what we can see from this one is that the strike is slightly toe side, but it's in the center of the sole. And the key thing there is for that, it's not getting near the leading edge. So we're using the middle part, the most versatile bit of the sole. So we've got a bit of margin of error each way. Now, it's where Miura has lacked, I think, the last couple of years, is that they've only had this option. So they haven't had any, say, options in terms of if you get a little bit steeper, which I'm now going to do. So if I get a little bit more handle lean, and then a little bit steeper onto it, we'll see that strike point change. So a little more handle down and forward. And as we can see here, that's moved that strike more towards the front edge. Now on firm turf, that's absolutely fine. When it gets soft, that starts to dig. So let's now go to the Y grind, which has the heavier bounce, and see how that changes those strike points. It's that last point about the leading edge, which is where that angle, that graduated front edge makes a big difference, because you've got more protection against that leading edge catching. The shallower and the sharper it is, the more chance of that front edge getting into the ground at the wrong time. So we'll start with that steeper delivery. So going to really get handle forward like we did in that last shot. So one, actually the contact feels more solid, but in complete contrast to the last one, that is now in the middle. We're now nowhere near that front edge in terms of strike point, which is really, really important, because that's the bit that is the worst thing you can have, because that's the dunce, the flub, the one that digs into the ground and goes 2 yards and you feel just revolted at yourself for. So now if I shallow this off, we'll see where that goes to as well. This is why it's important to have, particularly for the turf we get here in the UK, versatility to the sole shape, because we get such different sand conditions, turf conditions, firm in the summer with soft sand and soft in the winter with wet, firm sand, that we need the variety to play the kind of shots that we want to, rather than it just being, in some of the hotter climates, you get more overseeding to the turf. It's a thicker leaf grass, so it dies in the winter, then reseeds, and then grows back in the summer. There isn't that root structure there, and you get nice soft sand the whole year round. So if I shallow this off and make that same more kind of nipped delivery that I did the first one with the original tour wedge, so a very different strike point. Now you can still see the majority of that first hit. There is now a little mark on the very back edge. So what that means is that back edge catches the ground and that can kick it off. So a totally different contact point profile to the original tour wedge. So we'll have a look at the C grind as well. Now this is it's sort of, in some respects you could argue it's a bit of a halfway house. We've got the benefits of that blunted leading edge, which makes it harder for that front edge to grab and catch. But we've got a little bit more of a graduated back edge. So there's still a bit more effective bounce and progression than the original tour wedge, but not as much as the Y grind. So again, I'll start with the steeper delivery and then we'll look at that more kind of rounded underneath swing. So let's get that handle lead. So as we got with the Y grind, mainly that rounded front edge, that doesn't get anywhere near that front portion of the club head. So again, that's brilliant from that standpoint, but it's still utilizing a lot of the center section of the wedge, albeit that strike point still getting a little further back across the whole sole width than it did on the Y grind. So I'm now going to open it up. Now there's a bit of a mark on the back already, but I'm just going to open it up and play that softer, more underneath release, see where that strike point moves to. Now the benefit of the C grind is, because the back edge isn't quite as prominent, that as we work that club underneath and work shallower onto it, that back edge doesn't stick down quite so much. So it helps the club just to glide through the turf or the sand a little bit more, whereas the Y grind's really geared more to slightly kind of squarer shots or a steeper delivery. So if I open this up and just shallow that off, soften that delivery off. So what we get, we've still got, a harder mark, it's just darkened up that mark on that part, but it's not just a narrow hard mark on the back edge. We're still getting a reasonable bit of sole contact. So it's not just that very back edge that's taking the strike. And that's really the key, is we want to see a wide mark on the sole, because that means you're using the most sole possible for each delivery, which then gives you, say, margin of error, but that means the whole club's gliding forward off the turf rather than one bit catching, the front edge catching and it's stalling out, or the back edge catching and it kicking it forward. So it's critical to get the most versatile, but also using the most sole possible, because that means it gives you options either way rather than forcing you to deliver it a certain way. So we're using that sole shape, the bounce and the sole shape, to match to your delivery and to match the type of shots you play, as well as the sole, as well as the turf and the sand types that you play off. And it's really a combination of all aspects. So we're also going to look at the one thing with Miura, the feel. And I think this is an aspect where that redistribution of the weight, that mass moving a little bit higher, definitely has a bearing. So I think Miura's always been known as, over the years, a lovely feeling wedge, that softness to it. I think that's one of the things that, for me, that we've got back out of this series. So I do like the slightly neater shape in the crutch into the inside of the head. I think it's a slightly more even shape, which personally I find a bit more pleasing on the eye. But the bit that I noticed first time I hit them is that slightly more muted, dulled down sound to it, which I think ultimately everyone over the years, a lot of golfers have talked about a soft forging, whether it's irons, in particular in the irons, but a lot of wedges, take the Vokeys for example, are a cast head, rather than being forged. And there's a very, very small difference. Most of it's in the sound of it. It doesn't, just because they're cast doesn't make them a hard metal, but the note off the head is a little bit different. And these ones, if we really kind of zone in on the sound, there's a real softness to it. There's a real muted, toned down, quieter kind of sound off the club face. And it's a bit like putters. In that sound is really what feel is. So a softer sound off a putter face feels like the ball comes off a little bit softer, can make it feel a little bit more controlled. If it's a hard note, it feels like the ball jumps off the face. And with wedges in particular, we want, or a lot of golfers, we want that softer, muted sound and feel. These give you that. I mean, the other aspect of it, if we look at some of the numbers, is the spin. I mean, this is a short shot. Now, granted, it's a perfect lie, which makes it a bit easier. But, that a 50-yard shot, to get 7,500 revs of spin on a quiet shot with and this is a 54-degree wedge, I'm able to generate quite a lot of spin. So, spin, wedges, that's really what we're asking for out of the wedges. So again, 60 yards, 8,300. So with a 54-degree wedge, now if you ramp it up and play the same length of shot with a 60, then the spin's going to go up. So you can be more aggressive, more club speed, and we're going to get extra spin on top of that. So the performance off the heads, as well as the feel, as well as the versatility on the grind. And one other aspect, the head weights, they are not heavy. They sit underneath the Vokeys, which is a really key thing. I go back to the Vokeys because they are the highest selling wedge on the market. But across the board, wedge-wise, they've got heavy over the years. So the fact that these sit underneath those weights and sit at a more uniform weight to other brands, Miura, some of the irons sit slightly heavier, but the wedges are in a much better weight ratio. So it means it opens up from a purchasing point of view, there are many, many more golfers that these heads will suit and will allow us and players to fit them for them, but players to play these wedges. Miura as a brand is a bit of an aspirational brand, but to play what is widely regarded as the finest forging on the market, to play this brand in your wedges, to get spin, to get sole shape versatility, and a very, very pretty club head.